September 3, 1939, a date that would be etched into the memory of a generation. Across Britain, families huddled around radios, their faces tense with anticipation, waiting for Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's address. The air was thick with anxiety, as parents clutched their children and neighbors gathered together, united by fear and uncertainty. Just 2 days earlier, the German army had stormed into Poland, launching a brutal invasion that ignored Britain's ultimatum to withdraw. The world watched in disbelief as Hitler's forces advanced, threatening to plunge Europe into chaos once more. The deadline for Germany's response came and went. There was no reply from Berlin, only silence. At 11:15 a.m., Chamberlain's weary voice crackled over the airwaves. "This country is at war with Germany," he announced, his words heavy with sorrow and resignation. The words confirmed the nation's worst fears. A collective shudder ran through the country as the reality of war set in. The peace so desperately clung to for 2 decades was shattered in an instant. The bustling streets of London fell eerily silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Memories of the Great War haunted every household. Old soldiers recalled the horrors of the trenches, while families gazed at faded photographs of loved ones lost in the last conflict, dreading what might come next. There was no cheering, just grim acceptance. People left churches, shops, and workplaces in silence, their faces marked by worry and determination. Air raid sirens wailed over London, a false alarm, but a chilling sign of what was to come. The sound sent shivers down spines, a stark reminder that the skies above were no longer safe. Britain, having tried desperately to avoid another continental war, was now drawn inexorably into a fight for survival. The government mobilized, and soldiers prepared to defend their homeland. This was not a sudden decision, but the end of a long, painful road. Years of diplomatic efforts, negotiations, and hope had finally run out. Years of appeasement had failed. The promise of peace for our time now rang hollow, replaced by the grim reality of conflict. Hitler's broken promises and relentless aggression left no room for negotiation. Each treaty violated, each assurance ignored, made war inevitable. The invasion of Poland was the final straw. The world could no longer look away as innocent lives were uprooted and nations overrun. Britain realized the choice was no longer between peace and war, but between fighting now or being conquered later. Parliament stood united, and the call to arms echoed across the nation. The nation braced itself for the unknown. Ordinary people prepared for extraordinary times, queuing for gas masks and building barricades, determined to protect their homes and families. The cost would be high, but the alternative, submission, was unthinkable. Britain had no choice but to stand firm, whatever the sacrifice. The world was at war again. Alliances shifted, and nations everywhere faced the grim prospect of global conflict. The future was uncertain, but the resolve was clear. Britain would endure, united in the face of darkness, ready to fight for its survival and for freedom. To truly understand Britain's deep dread of war in the 1930s, we must look back to the aftermath of the First World War, a conflict that left scars across an entire generation. The year was 1919. The guns had fallen silent, but the trauma lingered. At Versailles, world leaders gathered to shape a new peace, hoping to prevent such devastation from ever happening again. Yet for Britain the cost was almost unimaginable. Nearly 1 million lives lost, with every family touched by grief and loss. Towns and villages mourned their sons, and the nation's psyche was forever changed. The Treaty of Versailles, intended as a safeguard against future conflict, instead planted seeds of bitterness in Germany. Many Germans saw the treaty as a humiliation, a wound that would not heal. The harsh reparations and territorial losses imposed on the Weimar Republic crippled its economy. Hyperinflation, poverty, and political chaos became daily realities, fueling anger and extremism among ordinary Germans. Into this turmoil stepped Adolf Hitler, a charismatic figure who promised to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its strength, and tear up the hated treaty. His words resonated with a nation desperate for hope. The Great Depression only deepened the crisis. As unemployment soared and hunger spread, Hitler's message of blame and renewal found a desperate, receptive audience, eager for change at any cost. By 1933, Hitler had been appointed chancellor. He moved swiftly, dismantling democracy, silencing opposition, and transforming himself into a dictator. The world watched as Germany changed overnight. In Britain, there was growing unease. Yet, memories of the Great War's horrors and a lingering sense of guilt over Versailles made many leaders hesitant to confront Germany directly. The fear of another catastrophe loomed large. Many in Britain clung to the hope that by addressing Germany's grievances, peace could be preserved. Diplomacy and negotiation seemed the only sane path forward. Appeasement, the policy of making concessions to avoid conflict, appeared safer than risking another devastating war. The public, still haunted by loss, largely supported this approach, but beneath the surface, the seeds of a new conflict were already taking root. Each concession emboldened Hitler, and Europe's fragile peace began to unravel. Britain's overwhelming desire for peace, while understandable, blinded it to the growing danger. The warnings were there, but few wanted to believe another war was possible. Soon, the world would pay the price for these choices, as the shadow of war returned to Europe once more. Appeasement, now seen as weakness, was once Britain's desperate hope. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, haunted by the last war, believed negotiation could prevent another. The policy, give in to Hitler's reasonable demands, hoping he'd be satisfied. The public supported it. No one wanted another generation lost in battle. Britain's military was unprepared, and the horrors of modern warfare loomed large. Many believed Hitler was rational, that once grievances were addressed, he'd stop. Chamberlain's personal diplomacy failed to grasp Hitler's true ambitions. Fear of communism and aerial bombing also drove appeasement, but Britain was playing by rules Hitler never intended to follow. From the very beginning, Hitler was determined to test the resolve of Britain and France. He pushed boundaries, watching closely to see how far he could go without facing real consequences. In 1935, Hitler boldly rearmed Germany, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles, which had strictly limited German military power after World War I. This was a direct challenge to the post-war order. The Allies issued strong protests and warnings, but ultimately, they took no meaningful action. Their reluctance to confront Hitler only emboldened him further. Encouraged by their inaction, Hitler took an even bigger risk in 1936 by sending German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. This was a gamble that could have led to war, but once again, there was no military response from Britain or France. Each successful gamble convinced Hitler that his opponents were weak and unwilling to fight. His confidence grew with every unchecked move. In 1938, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss, facing little resistance. Soon after, he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, claiming to protect ethnic Germans. Tension gripped Europe. Ordinary people anxiously followed the news, fearing that another devastating war was imminent. In a desperate attempt to avoid conflict, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler. The result was the Munich Agreement. The Sudetenland was handed over to Germany, and Czechoslovakia was left vulnerable and betrayed. Chamberlain returned to Britain to cheering crowds, famously declaring, "Peace for our time." Many hoped he was right, clinging to the belief that war had been averted. But Hitler's promises at Munich were empty. The policy of appeasement only encouraged his aggression, making him believe he could act without fear of reprisal. Winston Churchill, one of the few who saw the danger clearly, warned that appeasement was a disaster in the making. Yet, his warnings were largely ignored by those desperate for peace. Hitler realized that Britain and France were willing to sacrifice smaller nations to avoid another war. Their hesitation only fueled his ambitions. With each victory, Hitler's appetite for conquest grew. He began planning even more daring moves, convinced that no one would stop him. The world watched in suspense, hoping for peace, but fearing the worst. Behind the scenes, Hitler was already plotting his next steps. The policy of appeasement had failed completely. The stage was now set for catastrophe. Europe was on the brink of a conflict that would soon engulf the world. Britain's illusions of peace were about to be shattered forever, as the world plunged into the darkness of war. Chamberlain's "Peace for our time" lasted less than 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking his word. Britain finally saw Hitler's true intentions. Appeasement was dead. The next target was Poland. On March 31st, Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence, a line in the sand. If Germany attacked, Britain would be bound to declare war. It was a bold promise, but Britain was in no position to defend Poland directly. The guarantee was meant as a deterrent, but Hitler was unconvinced. In August, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world with a non-aggression pact, secretly agreeing to divide Poland. With the threat of a two-front war gone, Hitler's path was clear. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. The Polish guarantee had failed to prevent war. Britain's honor and credibility were now at stake. War was inevitable. The world braced for conflict. As war loomed, Britain mobilized for the unknown. Operation Pied Piper evacuated over 1 million children from cities, while Anderson shelters and blackouts became daily life. The Dig for Victory campaign turned parks and gardens into vegetable plots, boosting food supplies and morale. Gas masks were issued to all, a grim reminder of modern warfare's dangers. The nation steeled itself, united by fear and determination. After Britain declared war, Europe entered the phony war, a tense, uneasy calm. But in spring 1940, Hitler's blitzkrieg swept through Denmark, Norway, and then France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The British army was trapped at Dunkirk, facing annihilation. In a desperate rescue, hundreds of civilian boats helped evacuate over 338,000 troops. Dunkirk became a symbol of British resilience. With France defeated, Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill vowed to fight on. We shall never surrender. The Battle of Britain began. RAF pilots faced relentless Luftwaffe attacks. Against the odds, the RAF prevailed, forcing Hitler to abandon invasion plans. But the Blitz, nightly bombings of British cities, had just begun. The war was now total, and the home front was the new battlefield. Britain's darkest hour had arrived. Britain's decision to fight in 1939 defined its future. Appeasement had failed. Ignoring aggression would have meant surrendering to tyranny. By standing up to Hitler, Britain inspired global resistance. The war's cost was immense, but it led to the defeat of Nazism and the birth of the United Nations. The experience forged a new sense of unity and a drive for a fairer society, leading to the creation of the NHS. The spirit of Dunkirk and the Blitz became central to Britain's identity. The politiskt system kan come at the expense of justice and freedom. Britain fought because it had no other choice, and changed the world in the process.